Hello, everyone, and welcome to Audubon Society of Central Arkansas's meeting. I'm Dan Scheinman, the Vice President, and tonight our presenters are Christy Slay and Mike Slay. Dr. Christy Melhart Slay is a conservation biologist who directs science activities for the Sustainability Consortium. Her job entails leading projects with corporations, universities, and environmental organizations to advance sustainable agricultural and spatial tools for visualizing the environment and social impacts on our global supply chains. She has published in the journals Science and Nature Climate Change. She has a BS from Hendrix College and a PhD from the University of Arkansas. Mike Slay is a conservation biologist who directs the cave and karst science and conservation efforts for the Nature Conservancy. He works with numerous partners to conserve and protect karst species and habitats. He has a master's from the University of Arkansas and has helped discover over 15 new species to science and even has one named for him, Conocera Slay. Did I get that right? Slay.
There you go.
Right, there you go. That's right. And just for fun, on vacations, they like to lead cave ecology research tours on the island of Hawaii. So they know a thing or two about caves, and tonight they're going to be talking about bats and bat conservation. So take it away, Mike and Christy.
Share our screen. All right.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to give a little talk on bat biology, ecosystem services, and conservation. So we're tag teaming tonight, so we're going to hand off back and forth. I'm going to kick us off with a little basics about bats, a little overview. So bats have been around for a long time. Oldest fossil records from 50 million years ago. Maybe they're older than that, but that's the earliest one that's been found. There's about 1,300 different species of bats globally. And of course, they occur across all 6 continents where you would expect them. Of course, they're not in Antarctica, but they are globally distributed, and they are the 2nd largest order of mammals following rodents. And so they're a very large order and have a lot of diversity. And you can see this is a map of their distribution. And so you'll see the red and the yellow and orange is the highest amount of biodiversity. And so not surprisingly, those tropics, that equatorial zone is really where the most biodiversity is, really for all species, but that includes bats as well. And so here's just some pictures of the different types of bats. And so bats of the world, we've got of those 1,300 species, there's lots of different diversity. And so whether that's diversity in body shape, in color, in size, in facial characteristics. And so we have some flying foxes here on the right that they really do look like foxes. And then you have some bats, like the bat on the left here with those crazy facial features that we so often see. And sometimes those are the types of facial features that make people a little scared of bats. And so there's just a lot of diversity. There's also a lot of diversity in habitat, where they live, whether they live in the forest, or they live in caves, they live in trees. And the white Honduran bat there is actually creates its own home by chewing the leaves and making this little tent out of giant tropical leaves. And so there's all kinds of behavioral diversity and just a lot of fascinating characteristics when you look at bats. The bat on the upper right is a Mexican free-tailed bat. So you can see his little tail there if you look closely. And so that's why they call the Mexican free-tail, because he's got that tail. And so just wanted to point that out. Lots of different opportunities to learn about bats and learn about all their different characteristics. And so I want to kick us off a little bit talking about the services that bats can provide. And so we often think about bats in a number of different ways, but the services that they provide to humans are really important. And when we talk about ecosystem services, this is the way that we talk about natural systems in a way that makes it relatable to humans. And so I think everybody on this call certainly values nature for the sake of nature. But sometimes people need a little help understanding the real value that all of us derive from our natural systems. And so when we talk about ecosystem services, we're talking about forests, grasslands, caves, oceans. These are the services that they offer to us. So there's natural pollination of crops. There's services that clean the air. So you think about a forest taking pollution out of the air. Clean water, such as mangrove forests, they actually filter the water. Nutrient recycling, just the process of nutrients decomposing certainly is a service. Extreme weather mitigation, so you think about mangrove forests or those coastal wetlands that protect us from hurricanes. And then, of course, all of us really value that human mental and physical well-being. We love being in nature because it makes us feel good, makes our lives richer. And so these are just some of just to introduce you to ecosystem services and that topic. And then I want to share with you some of the services specifically that bats provide to humans. And so pest consumption, we always talk about how bats love to eat mosquitoes. And so we're very grateful to the bats for controlling our mosquito population. And farmers are grateful to bats too, because they provide a huge economic service for a farmer. And so there's a great study that really tried to quantify what's the economic impact of bats on our US agricultural economy. And the conclusion was that bats consume the equivalent of $23 billion in pest control a year. So you can imagine they're out there every night consuming pests that would otherwise damage our crops, and to the tune of $23 billion in economic value. So if you had to put pesticides or other biocontrols on the landscape, that would be a huge amount of money that would almost make farming untenable. And so those bats provide a really huge service to our farmers. Bats eat almost half their body weight every night. And so they are huge, they're huge consumers. And a mother who's nursing her young will consume 100% of their body weight a night. And so again, just a tremendous pest consumption that happens with our bats. I wanted to show this image because this is, as we, all of you are part of the Audubon Society, you're birders, you've probably looked at these types of Doppler radar migration events with birds. The same events happen with bats. And so this is Central Texas down by the Frio River. Mike and I were down there for vacation this summer. It's a beautiful place, full of caves and limestone, very much like the Ozarks, and also full of caves that have bats. And so there's millions of Mexican free-tailed bats. So that bat with that little tail that I showed you, he slides back, and they emerge every night in events that look like this on the Doppler radar. And so they emerge from their caves and they go out and really do some damage on those agricultural pests, particularly the corn earworm moth or the cotton bollworm. It has a lot of different names, but this is a common agricultural pest that affects lots of different crops. And these Mexican free-tailed bats absolutely help to control those pests. Pollination is another service. And so there's 500 species of fruits and other plants that depend on bats for pollination. And so again, this is a free service that bats provide that help to give us agave, cactus, cocoa, bananas, eucalyptus, guavas, mangoes. And so all those delicious tropical fruits, our chocolate that we certainly enjoy around Halloween. These bats are responsible for pollinating those crops. And certainly those farmers benefit from this free pollination service. And I love this picture of this bat. He's not yellow in his normal, he has brown fur in his normal state, but he's heavily out there, getting the nectar out of the flowers, and he's just absolutely covered head to tail in pollen. Seed dispersal. And so bats, they're fruit-eating bats, consume lots of fruits which contain seeds. And so they travel great distances as they forage every night. And as they consume these fruits, sometimes they drop the fruit and spread the seeds, or the seeds pass through the digestive tract. And there's been some great studies to show the benefits, the services that these bats are providing by eating these fruits. 150,000 bats can distribute enough seeds that it can regenerate 2,000 acres of forest. And so what we're finding is these bats, these fruit-eating bats, are absolutely critical in helping to reforest areas that have been either deforested through human processes, or storms, or wildfire, natural processes that disturb the forest. Bats can be an absolutely fantastic mechanism for reforesting disturbed forest. And another service that bats provide, they are interesting in the fact that they're highly disease resistant to diseases that affect humans. And so bats are completely immune, although they can have the malarial parasite inside their body. They don't exhibit any ill effects from malaria. So they're completely immune to malaria, even though they can carry it. Same thing with Ebola. They can absolutely carry Ebola. They have no effects on Ebola. And we found the same thing with potentially with the coronavirus, and so with COVID. And so they have this incredible immune system that really is a gateway for us to understand as humans what are some keys to our medicines and our keys to our own immune system. Because they're mammals and we're mammals, and yet they're immune and we're not. So there's some great medical discoveries that are yet to be made through our bats. And this is another service that bats provide in certain parts of the world. Bats are consumed as food. These flying fox bats in certain parts of the world are a vital source of protein for humans. And so obviously striking the balance when you're harvesting from nature to make sure that we're not impacting these bat species. But it is something just to be aware of, that these are, this is a service that the bats provide, is actually nourishment for people in places where there aren't often grocery stores. And so it's just something to be aware of. Bats are consumed as a food. And so that's a little overview of ecosystem services. And now we want to get into some biology and bust in some myths. And so first myth that we're going to bust tonight. So bats are just flying mice. So bats are, yes, they're mammals, very similar to mice, but they are their own order. And so they are their own group. They have very different characteristics from other mammals. They're in the order Chiroptera. And so Chiroptera means hand, and chiro means hand, ptera means wing. And so it's hand and wing. And you'll see in the diagram here that the bones that a bat has in its wing are completely analogous to our human bones. And so you can imagine a bat's wing being very similar in terms of the bones that we have in our arm. But then our hand bone in a bat, you can imagine those bones are very extended, and that's what attaches to the skin of the wing and gives it that flexibility, just like our own hands. You know, that really wraps its wings around itself when it flies, and it gives it that flexibility and that dexterity. And so we have a lot of similarities, also similar to birds. And so you'll see in the diagram there, bones are the same, but they're shaped a little differently, and they have slightly different functions. Most bats have a single pup per year, and so they have one baby, and it's really interesting. The mom and the baby have a call that they recognize, so they can recognize each other. So even in a roost of millions of bats, a mother can find her baby amongst all the other babies that are chattering. She can find her baby because of that unique call.
We're going to go back and forth on these myths just so that you can hear both of us talk a little bit. But the second myth that we wanted to bust tonight is that bats are blind. You've probably heard that a lot. Blind is a bat, bats are blind. That's actually false as well. And a lot of bats actually use eyesight when they're hunting. So those insectivorous bats or fruit bats that are out in sort of the twilight times of the day before dark, they're actually using their eyesight to navigate. And some bats that are out there, particularly some of the fruit bats, actually see better than humans. There's evidence that they can actually see in the ultraviolet spectrum, similar to what you see like with bees and other things. And that may be useful for them to be able to identify the flowers that they nectar on. And, those bats that, like insectivorous bats, they also use echolocation or bat sonar. And that's how they navigate when it's completely dark, when they can't use their eyes. In this diagram, you can see here, bats give off a very high frequency sound, a click, or just a click or a sound in the 20 to 200 kilohertz range. And that's actually higher than what humans can hear. We can hear up to about 20 kilohertz. Those of us that are younger can hear that probably better than others. And we know, as we continue to bird along, it would begin to lose being able to hear some of those really high frequencies that birds make. Well, these bats are actually calling in a higher set of frequencies than even birds use. So bats are using that sonar, that echolocation, as they send those signals out. It bounces off the prey that's out there with a return wave, and the bats use that information to be able to zero in on the prey that they're trying to catch, or they're using it to sort of map out where they're flying and to not fly into obstacles, move themselves around in caves and sort of cluttered habitats.
So all bats have rabies. That's another myth. We're going to bust that one. So less than 1% of bats carry rabies. And this is a chart from the Center for Disease Control. So this is U.S. Rabies occurrences. Oh, hello, Kitty. in the U.S. And you can see this chart goes from the 1960s all the way up to 2017. And you can see that the number of cases that are reported in bats has been pretty steady in that 500 to 1,500 bats per year range. And so on the low end, if you look at who's really carrying rabies, it's raccoons and skunks that really are up on the upper end of that chart. That's still not a lot of animals in terms of disease, but bats seem to really get a bad rap. So one of the things that's to remember is if you do see a bat that's acting strangely, so if it's on the ground, it's in a place it's not supposed to be, chances are it might be sick. It's a very good idea not to touch it, just in case. But bats do not carry rabies to any great degree.
All right, so our next myth, and this is probably one that you've heard about, and it's probably fitting that we're going to talk about it this month, given that Halloween is coming up, is that all bats drink blood. Well, that's actually mostly false. We do have several species that occur in Latin America, vampire bats, that rely on the blood of animals to survive. And most of the time they're feeding on cattle or other large animals. This is a picture of one of the species here. And sometimes they will actually come up and take little sips off the feet of chickens. And that's what you're seeing in this picture here. Two vampire bats that are up here close to the foot of this chicken. So they basically, they can sort of bite. They have really sharp teeth and they can make these really thin cuts that usually the animal doesn't feel at all. And then they just lap a little bit of blood up from that bite. So not all bats drink blood, but we do have a couple of them. And that kind of brings up the second component of this, is that, this association between vampires and bats, or Dracula and bats. And I did a little bit of research into this because I was curious about how the vampire mythology and the bat component of that got together. And so it turns out that the sort of vampire mythology that's out there actually predates the discovery of vampire bats. It wasn't until Europeans had come over to the Americas in the 1500s and 1600s and began to see some of this stuff and came back and began to report that they were seeing these vampire bats to folks in Europe. And so pre-1700s, there wasn't this connection between vampires and bats. Vampires in older mythology were associated with demons and with other denizens of the night, creepy crawlies that were out there, but bats weren't really associated with that. And it wasn't until it began to be popularized in the late 1800s, particularly by Bram Stoker's Dracula, that people began to associate bats with vampires. And one of the other myths we want to talk about is that, do bats actually want to fly and get in your hair? And what happens if that happens? And you could look at the two of us and you can probably look, if you believe this myth, which one of us have had bats in our hair? Probably me, because I don't have any hair anymore. And that's one of the myths that comes along with that. Bats fly into your hair and you have to shave it off, or there's issues with that. But it turns out that that's completely false. Bats have no interest in getting in your hair. And the reason that they get close to us is if we're out in the twilight, if we're out after dark, and we're giving off CO2, we're giving off heat, we're actually attracting bugs to us like mosquitoes and various other things. And the bats are targeting those insects that are flying in proximity to us. So they're actually going after the bugs as opposed to trying to get into our hair. We talked about the eyesight that bats have and the fact that most bats use echolocation. So they have all the skills necessary to keep from ever flying into our hair or really bothering us at night.
Let's talk a little bit about bat conservation. So what are the biggest threats to bats? Human encroachment. So humans moving into their space. There's a lot of humans on the planet right now, more than ever, and more every day. So we're crowding out a lot of nature, including bats. Climate change. And so again, humans burning our fossil fuels or changing the climate, which also impacts the availability of food, the timing and emergence of food, affects the climate patterns, and so which affects migration. Destruction of natural habitats such as forests and caves. The growing use of wind turbine energy. Now we want to think alternative energy is a good thing, and it is in certain circumstances, but it also where there's areas where there's lots of wind where we want to put our turbines, where it's good to put our turbines for generating energy. That's also migratory pathways for birds and bats. And so the trouble with bats is not actually those direct strikes, because they don't run into the wind turbines the way that birds do, because they can sense them. But it's actually the pressure differential that's created by the wind turbine, because there's positive and negative pressure there. And when the bats fly into that pressure differential, that's what causes the damage to them. Proliferation of harmful myths. And so we just busted some of those myths, but people are scared of bats. They have all kinds of reasons for going in and destroying habitat or other things. And so that proliferation of harmful myths around the world can cause harm to bats. And then diseases such as white nose syndrome.
So I thought I would talk a little bit about white nose syndrome in more detail. And you've probably heard about this. This was a disease that was first discovered in bats in New York in 2016. And it turns out that it was a fungus that invades our bats when they're hibernating in caves and mines in the wintertime. This is a cold-loving fungus that can be spread bat to bat. And the issue with this is that bats spend the summertime foraging on the landscape, raising their babies, and then as they get into the fall, they are eating as much as they can in order to develop big, thick fat reserves that they can then live on while they're in the cave, while they're hibernating during the wintertime. And this fungus gets on the bats, and it's itchy. You can see here it's growing around the nose, the face. It's these little white specks you can see on the forearms of the bats. So all of that fungus that's growing on the bats, itchy, it's irritating, and so the bats wake up because of that. And they try to groom themselves, they try to deal with this, and every time a bat wakes up in the wintertime in a cave, it burns through those fat reserves it has. So what ends up happening is that because of all of this, the bats wake up a lot more than they would in a normal year, and they end up burning through all of those fat reserves before the winter's open. And they end up starving to death before they can get back out onto the landscape where there's food available. So that's how this disease is impacting our bats, and it's pretty severe. Our bats don't have any natural resistance to this at all. And you can see here on this map here in 2016, it began, that's when we first discovered it, and the colors just show over the years how it's continuing to move west as the bats sort of interact with each other and spread it amongst themselves. And unfortunately, we don't have a really good handle. We know what the fungus is, and we know how it works, but we really don't know very well about how to treat, protect the bats that are in there. You know, one of the options that's been put up is it's a fungus, so maybe we just use a broad spectrum fungicide, and we just set that off in the caves, kill the fungus that's on the bat. But the issue with that is that fungi are also the base, the energy source for a lot of other animals that use a lot of other rare organisms that fungi provide energy for. And so if we use broad spectrum fungicides, we would eliminate all these other important rare species that are in these systems. So trying to dial it in to figure out how we can treat these bats or figure out how we can ensure that they're making it through the winter is complicated. And this is occurring so fast that the science is just difficult to keep up with. Luckily, we do know that in the New England areas, there is a small amount, 1 to 2% of the bats that have natural resistance. And there is some evidence that these colonies are beginning to stabilize at these low numbers and hopefully begin to grow. But as we pointed out, bats only have 1 pup a year, and so it's going to take a long time for these numbers to come back.
So globally, scientists and conservation organizations are tracking bat species. And so there's 21 bat species out of that 1,300 globally that are considered critically endangered. And certainly that there are efforts in place to protect those species. 83 species are considered endangered, and then 109 are considered vulnerable. 242 bat species are considered data deficient. So it just means we don't know enough about them. And so we don't know their conservation status, and we really don't know much about their population. There's a lot of initiatives globally that are focused on bat conservation. So Bat Conservation International is a great resource. If you've never gone to their website, it's full of information about bat conservation, about bats in general. And they do a lot of great work in the areas where bats occur, and especially in the tropics. There is a group that keeps track of, on the previous slide, of all of those bats of conservation concern, and that's called the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, or IUCN. And that's they have a bat specialist group that again monitors bat species globally and makes sure that those lists are up to date and that conservation efforts are going into the right places. There's bat scientists around the world who contribute to the science and the conservation of bat species. And zoos, we oftentimes forget. We think about zoos as in terms of exhibits and a nice place to go, but really the main work of our big zoos is to do science and conservation work around the world, and they are pivotal in understanding the conservation of bats globally. Government policies, so there's a number of government policies that actually help to protect bats and set regulations so that bats are protected. And then there's conservation organizations globally, like the Nature Conservancy, or TNC. So Mike's going to tell you a little bit more about the work that he does here in Arkansas.
Right. So I'm going to talk specifically about the bats that we have here in the state. We have 16 species that have been documented here, and you can kind of broadly think about the bats that we have in the state as sort of two main groups. We have bats that are just found in the woods, so our forest bats. And that's pictures of some of these bats are here on this first slide, like the eastern red bat, the evening bat, the hoary bat. And we've talked about this bat as well, the Mexican free-tailed bat. Christy talked about how that bat is large numbers of the bats occur in Texas, but they also actually make it up at least to the River Valley area here in Arkansas. So if you're in South Arkansas, you could potentially encounter some of these Mexican free-tailed bats as well. Now, these are bats that are more on the landscape, opposed to the next group, which is what I'm more familiar with because of my background. I do a lot of cave work. And of course, you're going to hear a lot more about cave bats than you will about forest bats today. You can sort of think about the cave bats sort of in 2 broad categories too. Say if you were with me and we were doing a winter survey in a cave, and we were going to count the bats that were there, and we were looking for field characteristics for how to separate some of these. One of the 2 main things that we would look at would be, are the bats clustering together, or are the bats sort of hanging individually by themselves? Because that helps us figure out which species they are. I'll point out as well that I sort of distinguish between forest bats and cave bats, but for our cave bats, it's only the gray bat, which is this species, and the Ozark big-ear bat, which is this one, that occur in caves year-round. So you'll find them in the summer and you'll find them in the wintertime. But the other species, like the Indiana bat, the little brown, and these here, you only find them hibernating in caves in the wintertime. You'll occasionally find one in the summertime, but most of the bats actually go out onto the landscape, into the forest, and live in the trees and forage in the forest during the summertime. All right, so I thought I would go through and sort of show some of the different cave bats that we have, some of the characteristics that's helpful to use when you're doing field characteristic identification. And I hope that you look, sort of, hopefully you can memorize these really quickly, because I'm going to have a series of questions and quiz once we go through this and see how many of these you can kind of get after we go through some of these characteristics. So the first one I want to look at is the big brown bat. Well, that's kind of obvious by the name. It's a large bat. It's probably big is relative, just like you think about the greater yellow legs versus the lesser yellow legs. It's always way easier to have them side by side to realize the difference in there. So it's the same kind of thing with big versus little in bats. But this is one of our largest bats that we have. It's probably lengthwise from head to tail. It's about 4 to 5 inches long. So it's relative to our other bats, which are more like 3 to 4 or a little smaller. That's kind of the relative size that we're talking about. So this is our biggest bat. It's big. It's obviously sort of uniform brown. It has these dark forearms. And if you look at it front on, it kind of has a dog-like face, sort of fox-like face. And usually when you see these in a cave, they're hanging by themselves. They might be just their face sticking out of a crack and crevice, and they'll be often very close to the entrance. Another one of our species is the tricolored bat. This was one of our most common bats. It's usually hanging by itself, but this was just a great picture to sort of show a few of them. This is not typical normal behavior for them to be in kind of a little small cluster, but this bat is about 3 inches long. And the easy field characteristic for this one is the pink forearms and the ears and the nose, combined with the fact that usually it's hanging by itself. Another one of the species, this is one of our endangered species. This is the northern long-eared bat. And just like its name, the ear itself is sort of longer relative to the face compared to the other Myotis species that it's associated with. That's somewhat hard to see sometimes when you're in the cave. What's helpful is if you look here at this picture, if you're looking directly at the bat, you can sort of see that the ears and the face kind of make a upward pointing V, sort of an upside down V. And the other characteristics, look at the face itself, it looks like it's sort of wearing black spectacles or black glasses, kind of around that sort of black and white mask. They also like to hang out in crevices, and that's helpful as well to be able to help with identification. One of the clustering bats that we have is the little brown bat. So you think about big brown bat versus little brown bat. Well, this is where that comes in. This bat's only 3 to 4 inches long, so it's a little bit smaller than a big brown, but it clusters together. That's one of the main differences compared to a big brown bat. It's also more uniform in color. It's important to sort of, when you think about little brown bats compared to the next bat I'm going to talk about, the Indiana bat, they're very closely related, and the characteristics that separate them are sometimes confusing. But typically for a little brown bat, you're going to see sort of this shiny brown fur. It's going to have a dark nose and ears, and they're going to be kind of tightly clustered. Now compare that to its closest relative, which is the Indiana bat. Now you can see this, the Indiana bats in the wintertime, they pack in really, really tight. Compared to the little brown, which had that kind of dark face, Indiana bats have a pink nose. And you can see that in the cluster here. You can see all these little pink noses sticking out at you. So that's kind of helpful when you're doing identification. And also the head on it is supposed to look sort of like the head of a buffalo, but as many as that I've seen, I never can really see that. So some characteristics are helpful and some others aren't. But the main one is sort of the pink nose and the fact that it tightly clusters together in the wintertime. And that clustering is important when you think about our gray bat, which is our other endangered species in the state. Just like its name, it's pretty uniform gray. Now, this is one of the species that uses caves in the summer as well as in the winter. The main difference is that the clusters that these bats make, even though they're clustered, it's a little looser. You can see space in between the individuals. They're not as tightly as sort of what we saw with those Indiana bats in the previous picture. And a lot of times in the wintertime, what's helpful is some of the bats on the edges will be hanging with their wings out a little bit, kind of looking like your stereotypical, what you'd think to see like a Dracula hanging upside down on a ceiling somewhere with his arms out a little bit. That's kind of what they do. Another one of our species that we have is the eastern small-footed bat. This is a really small bat. You can see the scale size of this bat relative to this person's hand. It has kind of shiny brown fur, distinct black mask. Usually in a cave, you'll find it tucked into a really tight crevice. It's not really common in caves. It's actually more common to be found under large rocks and glade systems, but we do occasionally encounter them in cave systems close to the entrances. And finally, we've talked about northern long-ear bats. Let's talk about big-ear bats. You can see the size of that ear relative to the face. When they say big, they do mean big. This is really distinct bat. If you would see one of these in a cave, besides the really long ears, it kind of has a sort of pig-like snout. If you were to get close and look at it, you can see these clusters here. You can see the ears sticking out. And one of the things that big ear bats do is that if they're in a cave and it's cold and they're trying to conserve heat, they'll actually wrap their ears around their head in kind of a curl like a ram's horns. And that's what you're seeing in this picture here. The ears are sort of curling around part of the head and the body. That's to conserve heat. And you can also see that mixed in here. You see some bats with their ears sticking out, and you see others that are curled back like ram's horns. All right. Quiz number one, question number one. I hope you took some notes on that. Feel free if you want to try to answer some of these questions, just throw them in the chat. So first question, what is this species here on the top? It's looking out at you from sitting on a little crevice, a little ledge. It's got that kind of V shape in the ears and the face. Got kind of a spectacles on its face. That's the northern long-ear bat. That was close,
Sorry,
Dan.
Dan.
You got bat right. So we'll give you a third of the points.
Being a bat biologist is hard.
Now, Dan, what's the species here on the bottom? It's kind of big relative to this one. It's brown. It's kind of got that dog-like face. Big brown bat. That's right. Yep. And this is pretty common, the way that you would see them close to an entrance. It's just hanging out horizontally on a ledge like this and hanging by themselves. All right, next two. What is this cluster of bats here on the left? Kind of uniform color, not really tightly clustered together. That's right, gray bats. You can see this guy here, he's kind of hanging with his arms kind of out. That is a gray bat. That's a cluster of gray bats in a cave in the wintertime. Good guesses. What about this bat? This one's a little harder. Pretty small. It's got a pink forearm, a little hard to see.
By itself.
Hanging by itself.
Has pink ears.
That's a tricolored bat. All right. Dan, you're gonna have to come with me next time we go caving. I throw this in here because when you look at this bat, you can see it's got all this condensation. So a lot of times the individual tricolored bats will be hanging on the ceiling in the wintertime where there's lots of condensation on the walls and on the ceiling, and they get covered in that condensation. And if you shine your light at them in just the right way, they look like they're white. The light reflects all of them and they look like they're white. And so often I'll have people say, man, Mike, I saw a white bat in a cave. I'm like, nah, you didn't see a white bat. It's one of these tricolored bats covered in condensation. And that response has worked great until about 2 years ago, when some colleagues in Missouri sent me a picture of an actual albino tricolored bat, completely white, sticking out on the wall. It was the first time I'd ever seen one. It was really cool. But now I can't just say that it's condensation on the bat. I'm like, well, hopefully you got a picture. Maybe we can see if it's an albino bat or not. But we do occasionally get albino bats as well, just like you get the same kind of thing with some of our bird species. Last question, what are these two bats here peeking out of this crevice? Dark faces. I'll give you a clue. This is my finger for scale, and these are the two bats sticking out of this little tiny crevice. Anybody want to take a guess? Eastern small-footed bats. So remember, that's the really small one. You can see that just with my finger for scale. That's a tiny little crevice that these two bats are sticking out of. The only way that I even happened to see these in the cave is that it was a low entrance to get into, and I was on my hands and knees crawling into the cave, and these two guys were right at eye level. And that's the only way. I just happened to be looking at the right spot in this crack in the ceiling to even see them there, close to the entrance. And it's one of the few. I've been in a lot of caves, and I've only seen eastern small-footed bats probably 2 times. So not really common. More common in those glade habitats, but you do occasionally see them. Well, that gets us through our field identification course, and talk a little bit about what the different things that we can do to sort of help the bats that we have here in Arkansas. And one of those big things is to just, particularly for our species that are using caves, just to limit cave disturbance when these colonies are in the sites. And so for caves like Blanchard Springs Caverns, if you've ever been there and done any of the tours, you know that the Discovery tour, the longer tour that takes you down to the stream, is closed during the wintertime. And the reason that that's closed in the wintertime is because there's about 500,000 gray bats that overwinter there. And so staying out of those areas like that while those bats are there, limit disturbance, limit them waking up and burning through the fat reserves. The same kind of thing for our maternity colonies. So sites where gray bats and those are bigger bats are raising their babies in the summer, not going into those sites when the moms are in there with their pups, because if the colonies get disturbed, sometimes the babies will fall off the ceiling. And once they do that, they can't get back up to the ceiling. They can't get back to their mothers, and they'll die. So limiting disturbance during those particular times or at particular caves is really helpful. Another thing that we do as researchers and a lot of cavers that go regularly to caves is to ensure that we're using clean cave gear. I talked about white nose syndrome earlier. We can inadvertently pick up this fungus when we're in a cave where it occurs and move it to a site where it doesn't occur. And so there are decontamination protocols that have been developed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service from researchers sort of studying how to kill this fungus on our clothes. And we use those decontamination protocols to ensure that we've got clean cave gear in between cave visits or daily visits. So that's just general good procedure to make sure you always have good, clean cave gear before you go. And then a lot of these bats are found in the forest and then, on the landscape. So ensuring that you've got good forest management, ensuring that you've got good, healthy trees that are out on the landscape that are available for the bats to use, maternity sites, good, healthy forests that are producing a lot of prey, a lot of insects that the bats can feed on. Some bats focus more on riparian corridors where they're feeding on emerging insects that are coming out of the streams. And so ensuring that our riparian corridors are intact and healthy along with our streams is good. And then one of the things you may have already done is just putting out artificial bat habitats around your house, putting up a bat box and seeing if you can get bats to come and live at your place with you while you're there. And there's different kinds of boxes that are out there, small bat boxes like you can get or build on your own, like Bat Conservation International has plans for if you want to build your own, or there's a lot that are out there that you can buy already made and putting those up at your house to try and attract bats. And there's actually larger structures that can be used as well, and that's what a picture of this is. This is called a Braden bark structure. It is basically it's just a big rubberized sheet that is wrapped around the top of this telephone pole, not tightly, but allows bats to crawl up the telephone pole and hang out. And what this structure does is it mimics bark that's sloughing off a dead or dying tree. A lot of our forest bats, or even a lot of our cave bats like Indiana bats, when they're on the landscape in the summertime, they raise their babies under these sort of sloughing off bark areas. So this structure sort of mimics what you see on the natural habitat. And actually we've installed 3 of these Braden bark structures on one of TNC's preserves here in Northwest Arkansas, our Kings River Preserve. We put these up in April. The bats found them and began to use them in May, and they used them all summer long. All 3 poles are beginning to get used. So if you put structures up, the bats are going to find them, and if it's in a good place that they really like, they're definitely going to begin using them. So it's kind of a neat way to be able to attract bats close to where you're at. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the work that I've been engaged with, some of the work that I've been doing, and as well as a lot of the partners that I work with, like the nature, the Forest Service, the National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and other state agencies. So some of the stuff that we do is just cave survey work, where we're going in and we're trying to understand where white nose is occurring, how's it moving across the state, how are the bats responding to that. We do hibernation surveys, we do maternity surveys. those hibernation surveys, I've talked a little bit about hibernaculum surveys, and I just want to talk briefly about kind of the different ways that we do that. And one of them is real simple. You just go in and you count every bat that you see in there. We often take just little clickers. We're just counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But for some of the larger colonies, we may actually have to estimate area that the bats are in, and then we know the number of bats per square meter that typically falls into that. And so we can take an area measurement and multiply that by that number per square meter and come up with an estimate that way. And then there's indirect ways that we can also get at how many bats are in a particular site. And sometimes that might be measuring the area where there's fresh guano on the ground. If there's fresh guano there were bats on the ceiling hanging above that. So you get an indirect estimate of bat use that way. You can also do that with looking at the staining on the ceiling. When bats are hanging on by their claws on the ceiling, the oils on their feet actually leave oil on the ceiling. And so ceiling stain is another way to sort of indirectly estimate the bats that are used in a particular cave. Maternity colonies or summer counts are somewhat similar. Sometimes we go into these caves and we'll just estimate the amount of area that these bats are hanging on the ceiling. But what we do more often is do exit counts using night vision scopes and night vision goggles. And that's what a picture you see here is I'm sitting out of a cave waiting for Ozark big-eared bats to fly out. And I'm just sitting there and just counting them as they come out using the night vision scopes. That's a way that we can get information on these maternity colonies without actually going in the cave and disturbing them. And then finally, another thing that we're doing, we do this a lot with partners, is sort of landscape surveys, sort of understanding how bats are moving around in the forest, where they're going from their summer to their winter sites. And that's sort of a mix of different techniques. We might use telemetry, where we're putting radio transmitters on bats and tracking them using different radio antennas or flying. And I have a video that I'll end with that sort of gives a little bit more detail about how one of these telemetry studies work, at least sort of getting the radio and transmitters onto the bats. We also band bats. We capture them using mist netting, and you can see this is a northern long-eared bat that's been captured in a mist net, and then we banded it here with a band on the wing. And just like with our birds, those bands have unique numbers. And if we find that bat later on, say, this bat was banded, if this bat was banded in Northwest Arkansas in Benton County in the summertime, and we found it in Newton County in the wintertime, then we know that these bats are using these two areas depending on the season. That's really helpful to understand relationships with flyways and migratory pathways and other information like that. And one of the other things that we do is acoustic surveys. So just like birds, when bats echolocate, this is what you're seeing here, a sonogram. This is a bat echolocating, looking for a prey, looking for an insect. Those echolocation calls are actually unique to species. You can identify the species based on the call that it makes. You can't hear it, but we can record it, and we can use computer software to help us figure out what the species is. So just like you can stand out there and say that's a American robin versus a northern cardinal, you can do the same thing with these echolocation calls for species. And the software helps us do that. So that gives us a way to sort of passively track what bats are using area without having to stand out there every night trying to record or see what bats are coming by. And I'm not a night owl. I don't do a lot of night bat work. And so this acoustic work works great for me because I can set these monitors up, go get a great night's sleep, come back the next day and just pull down the data and figure out what species is there. And so another thing that we're doing, so this is sort of some of the work that I'm doing here in the state and here in the Ozarks, is that we talked about the threats earlier. We talked about the different things that are impacting some of our species. And because of those threats, we really need to understand what those threats are and prioritize where we want to work across the state. Since we have limited money, we have limited time, we have limited staff. So we've developed a process to sort of look through those threats and sort of figure out where we want to work. And this is what this map shows. I won't go into any detail other than, the threats are sort of based on red to green, red being a higher threat versus a low threat. And that kind of helps us understand where we might want to work, what caves we want to work at. And we've done this for Arkansas. We've done this for the Ozarks in Oklahoma, and we're currently doing the same process in the Ozarks of Missouri. So ultimately, we'll have this eco-regional level map that'll help us do the conservation work that we're doing to help protect our bats as well as our other cave species. And I thought I would just mention briefly, some of the other sort of protection and habitat enhancement projects that are ongoing. if you bird it out in the Sycamore, if you go into Stone County, you go into Mountain View, gotten out on the district there, the Forest Service district, you may have seen or you may have heard about the Happy Bat Project. That's where the Forest Service is doing forest management for Indiana bats. And they are managing about 80,000 acres to improve foraging habitat for Indiana bats. We have Indiana bats that are using caves on the Forest Service in the Sycamore area, so the Blanchard Springs area, the Mountain View area. And so we're trying to improve the habitat for these bats to forage at. And I also just list some of the state natural areas that you've probably been to. I just point these out, Slippery Hollow Natural Area, Devil's Eyebrow Natural Area, Fushi Cave Natural Area. These are all Arkansas Natural Heritage Commission sites that were acquired to protect the bat habitats that's there. They also have tons of cool birds, during migration. They're really cool places to go visit. And as well as, we, the Nature Conservancy, we've also been acquiring properties partially for protecting bat habitat. But as an example, our Kings River Preserve, we've actually acquired a little over 10 miles of river along the river to protect the river, to make sure that the river is healthy. But it also has this wonderfully intact riparian corridor that gray bats are using as well for foraging habitat. And so we get some indirect benefit for some of our large preserves that way. And I'll mention as well, we've just acquired a new preserve here in Northwest Arkansas, the Logan Springs Preserve. We hope to have open probably after the start of the year so that people could go. And we've already, Christy and I have been birding it some. We've gotten, I think I saw Michael Lenz was on here. He's provided some cool bird pictures for our kiosks that are going up. And so that property was acquired to protect habitat associated with a cave, but it's also an awesome, phenomenal place to do some birding at. And I thought finally I would show just a short little video of friends of ours that were studying where gray bats forage on the landscape here in Northwest Arkansas. And so I'll just kind of talk about what you're seeing here. And so what you're basically seeing is we've captured gray bats that are flying out of a cave. And Patrick has one in his hand right now, and he's actually putting a band on the hand. This is a male gray bat. You'll see he just puts the band on and lets it go. So the males at this site, we were just putting bands on, but for the females, we really wanted to know where these females are foraging when they leave the cave each night. And to do that, we had to put radio transmitters on the back. So what you're seeing here is we have a female gray bat, and Patrick is putting a transmitter, he's gluing a transmitter on the back of the bat. And this will actually allow us to track the bat every night. These transmitters last on the bat for about 2 weeks. The glue that's there is not permanent, so it begins to decay after about 2 weeks, and the transmitter falls off. While that bat is out every night foraging, we have an airplane in the air that's flying a grid, and we can actually track where this bat is foraging on the landscape. And we did this for several, I think it was 10 individual female gray bats. And so that allowed us to help identify hot spots of foraging area along our riparian corridors, along our streams. We really wanted to know where that was occurring. You can see the antenna there. But that helped us sort of identify where these bats are working on the landscape, because it might be places that we would want to also protect in addition to the cave, ensuring that those foraging habitats are protected as well. So that wraps up the talk that we've got. And I think if we've got time for questions, then we can do that.
Thanks, Mike and Christy. So again, if you have questions, you can unmute yourself or you can type your question in the chat box and I will relay it to our guests. We did have, let's see, going back to the beginning, John asked if are bats diet selective by species?
That's a great question. And so they are. So you think about, the bigger the bat, the bigger prey that it can take. Particularly for the, I'm thinking about the Arkansas species, but the same thing with some of our fruit bats and other bats. Yeah, they will specialize on particular food items. And so, and I'll provide an example of that. Ozark big ear bat. So think about the bat with the really long ears. That bat is actually a moth specialist. So it takes sphinx moths. That's what it really likes to catch. It's kind of large, slightly larger moths. And one of the things that it does is it'll catch a moth, it'll take it back to its roost site overnight, and it eats the body and the wings just fall down to the ground. And so when we're checking out talus caves, we're checking out caves in an area that we think might be habitat for Ozark bigelow bats, even if it's not in the cave, even if we don't see the bat, we're looking for moth wings on the floor. If we see moth wings on the floor, it tells us that this is likely an Ozark bigelow bat habitat, and we might want to come back and see if we can confirm those bats are there. So absolutely, but depending on the species and depending on size, they do select different prey.
Well, then speaking of moths, do bats do bats have a conflict with moths and other pollinators? Do they compete for resources?
That's a great question. So in terms of pollination, typically there's enough pollen to go around. And so depending on what the species is, there's not a lot of conflict there. And thinking about the specialization piece, our nectaring bats too oftentimes have specialized face shapes, for fitting down into flowers and specific flowers and nectaring, and therefore pollinating specific flowers. And so there's some adaptation that's happened over the years to make those bats specialized to be able to feed, forage, and pollinate. Great question.
And Sierra asks, what education and work experience led you both to working with bats?
I'll go first. So as an undergraduate in college, I had a major professor who was studying, he wasn't studying bats, he was actually studying cave fish and cave crayfish. And I volunteered because I began to get interested in caves. I wanted to go explore caves. And so I volunteered to go for him to look for things in caves because I was really interested in biology in general, was interested in species. And he sent me to several caves, and I rediscovered populations of these really rare species that hadn't been seen in probably 20 years. And it was in sites that were within about 15 minutes of where I grew up in Northwest Arkansas. I was so stunned that I could make a major discovery literally nearly in my backyard that I was hooked on doing cave ecology and cave work. And bats are just kind of a natural part of that because bats use caves. That's why most of my background is sort of associated with cave bats, but it was the fascination with the cave and just the general animals that were there that led me into that. And just as I began to learn more and more about everything that's there, bats were just a natural part of that.
And for me, I really discovered biology. I noticed that Kathy Ross was on here. So Bob Ross was my high school science teacher, and I fell in love with biology in Bob's class. And then many of you probably know Ellen Turner, and she was the next teacher I had after Bob. So how can you not be a biologist after having those two back to back? So I always knew I wanted to be a biologist. I just didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. And I ended up going back to school actually to study birds. And so my PhD is in bird conservation and bird studying 4 species of birds. But then I met Mike in grad school, and he's a cave biologist. And so I started going caving with him. And so that was just a natural transition to be interested in bats. Going and caving with him and actually seeing him up close.
Very nice, very nice. Anyone else have a question?
Dan, I've got kind of a long question.
Can you make it a shorter question?
Yeah, make it short. We're seeing behavior at a house that we have on the Little Red River. I had assumed the bats were using the caves across on the bluffs from us. And during the night, they are using our porch as a roosting area. And so a couple of things that your discussion brought to my mind. One, there is white stain around the edge of the porch where they're actually roosting. And I didn't know if that was from the oil that you mentioned, or if that actually might be white nose. The other was that the first time I saw the bats, they were in a cluster, a large group, not a large group, but about 12 to 15 bats all bunched up together. The picture that I sent you a while back, we said was a large brown bat,
Big
and you
brown
said
bat.
they were usually singular, not clustering bats. So I was wondering, might I have two different types of bats, and or would I normally see those brown bats in a cluster?
That's a good question. When I was talking about clustering, I was specifically thinking bats in the wintertime in caves. So big brown bats that we see in caves in the wintertime don't cluster, but in the summertime, big brown bats move out onto the landscape and often into old structures, or if you're unlucky enough, into your attic. But they will form clusters, of so they could be up to several hundred bats in there, for some slightly larger colonies. But you have the female big brown bats that are coming together to raise their babies in those clusters. The reason they do that is just partially for protection, but also those bodies will heat that space up and the babies grow faster when the temperature is elevated slightly. That's why if you put up a bat box outside, you want it to sort of be facing the sun, kind of facing a southward direction, because they like to have their small maternity colonies in kind of an area that gets extra heat in the summertime.
Okay.
But to answer your sort of white staining question, it could be bat urine. It might be what it is.
Okay.
Probably wouldn't be the fungus, but it could be urine, or it could be, if their guano is landing there, it could be that the guano is also staining well.
Okay.
May have to put you
Mike,
a flower pot under where they're roosting at. You'll have some great fertilizer.
Flower pot wouldn't be big enough. So
That's pretty cool. You
My-
got that many.
Dan's cut me short tonight, so I may shoot you a note and get you
We
to
went
call
long, so that's
me.
on.
A lot more discussion.
One last question then from John is, if there are advantages to clustering for body warmth and safety in numbers, why don't all bats cluster together?
That's a good question. It's a life history choice that different species make, and I think that in some instances, if you have really large clusters, like for tricolored bats, I'll just give this as an example. Tricolored bats typically hang individually. They're typically in the much colder areas of the cave, which often is close to the entrance. And so if you had clusters of 10 to 15 bats that were there close to the entrance, that's also places where predators can get to. Raccoons will go pretty deep into the site. So it could be that over time, this species is just, those that have hung individually have just had a better chance to survive and be able to reproduce. And we actually see something similar to bats that cluster closer in the context of white nose syndrome, have a higher risk of actually getting it from one of their neighbors. And so some of these, like the little brown bat species is a clustering bat, but in some places in the New England area, it's those individuals that for whatever reason are antisocial or their genetic makeup is slightly different. They're not coming into contact as much with the fungus because they're not clustering up and they're surviving. So there's just sort of that variability in there that's built in. And that I think facilitates sort of why some species do that and why some don't. Social distancing. Right. And one other thing I would point out is that the clustering, that for the Indiana bat, the clustering, they tightly cluster that way as well because they like to hibernate in really cold areas, usually high on the ceiling. So they don't really have that much of an impact for predators. Clustering in the summertime for like our gray bats and our bigger bats, they're doing that. They sort of like to cluster and raise their babies in dome-shaped sections of caves. And those domes capture extra body heat, which is better for the babies.
Cool. Fascinating. Well, thank you very much, Christy and Mike. Really appreciate you sharing all your information with us. Hope everyone has a better appreciation of bats now going forwards, and there'll be one less thing to be scared about on Halloween.
Thank you all.